Good afternoon, everybody, and Juanita, welcome. Great to have you back again.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
Well, it is, and what I'll do, I'll just, if I can share my screen, I'll just, where are we? Share screen, and off we go there. So we'll just go through it. I thought today what we'd do is kick off with some ideas just around the main issues that I think people find in regard to estate and succession planning. So just to introduce us, Juanita, a senior associate with Murdoch's, and myself, both of us have been doing this for some time, so I'm sure there's lots of wisdom coming out of today's session.
Let's hope so. Lots of war stories.
That's it. So I just want to start off with a question. Do you have your estate plan sorted? And I guess if you did, you wouldn't be here. So what I've found over the years is that worst case scenarios are, and this is sadly for most people, at the end of the day, if you don't get this sorted, you end up with family squabbles. People are fighting over money. Occasionally you'll get a contested will, and sadly, in worst case scenarios, you've got siblings where they never talk again. And this is so easily fixed, and it's so inexpensive to fix this, to get this right. But sadly, these are the worst case scenarios. And I often ask the question, when I'm talking to groups especially, and that is, is there anyone in the room who knows a family where this has happened? And Juanita, I'm sure you've had plenty of situations where you've seen this, and most people have, haven't they?
Absolutely. Yep, it's quite common these days, unfortunately so.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I thought I'd just go through and say what are the four biggest issues in regard to, as far from what I see, certainly in rural areas, what are the four biggest issues that create this sort of angst at the end of the day? And the first one is, apart from the obvious issues of procrastination and people feeling invincible, because at the end of the day, estate planning isn't a dinner table conversation, is it? So, people don't sit down at dinner and say, "Oh, let's talk about what happens when I die." And also, the truth is, people feel invincible around this, and they feel like, they'll get to it one day. It's like they just keep putting it off, and invincibility wins. But so, apart from those two big issues, I went back and I did a survey of all the people I'd done work with over the last 2-3 years, Juanita, and these just stood out in every situation. I think it was bar one. So I'm not sure what your experiences were, but the first one is the lack of what I call intergenerational communication issues. In other words, the lack of conversation between the generations. Have you struck this very often?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, it can sometimes be a difficult situation, but the lack of conversation might come from just being the personality type that finds it difficult to talk about. It can be different values between the generations. And it is a difficult conversation, but once it's started, then it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also works in generational levels as well too. People, 60 and plus, their parents never talked about this sort of stuff. Just shut up and sort of, dad would fix it and that was that. So there was never a conversation, I think, from that generation. The next generation down, probably, 40 to 60 in that bracket, if parents are still alive, they don't want to, the kids then don't want to talk to the parents about it because it will make them look as if they have expectation and entitlement attitude, and it makes them look like they're greedy and kind of going, what am I going to get when you die? And so therefore the kids don't talk to the parents, so to speak, and so there's kind of a death of conversation from both ways. That the old people, it's not something they talk about. The next level, they don't want to be seen to be hungry and looking for what they're going to get out of it. And the younger generations are the ones that, the under 40s are the ones that really get missed out and have absolute confusion in regard to what they're going to do. In fact, I went out to the other side of Broken Hill recently and saw a family there. The grandparents, they've been asked, and the grandparents refused to have the conversation.
Oh.
who are on the farm. They just will not talk about it. Like they've been asked to have the conversation, no, won't talk about it. The son, the third generation, the grandson is there, and he's saying to Dad, Dad, what can we do? I've got siblings. Where do I go from here? And of course, the father then can't tell the son anything, and the son has now had a child. So there's 4 generations on this farm, and they couldn't get the conversation going. And it was interesting. I went out there and kind of, as usually happens, within 15 minutes you can kind of work out what needs to happen and how you would structure the right answer to get the right result and to keep it fair, to keep everybody on path and to create a great outcome. But until the grandparents are prepared to start the conversation, I mean, they're the ones that own the farm. So
makes it hard. I think too when there's a number of children involved, so it may be difficult for the parent to talk to each of the children at the same time or not the same time, and there's also dynamics between children sometimes. So between that generation with multiple children, that can also add another layer of difficulty which sometimes needs to be overcome.
Look, absolutely. And so the first one really is the conversation, and I think we're all in agreement there. And as I said, when I look back over the last 3 years, this was the issue for everyone bar one of my clients that or people that I dealt with over the last 3 years. Everyone had the same issue, and number 2, which is the fact that when you have this intergenerational communication stalemate, so to speak, eventually it's going to start leading to conflict. And I don't mean conflict as in punch up, so to speak, but I mean it's conflict in regard to narkiness or people not knowing what their options are. And it's like, well, do I stay here on the farm or do I go and get something else? Do I go and get a job in the city? Because of the uncertainty in regard to what's happening, conflict does start to happen. And when all of a sudden you are having blues between the generations, not necessarily and not always ending up in fistfights, but I mean there's just an underlying anger and resentment. And of course, once the second generation gets married and so on, I mean that just multiplies, doesn't it?
That's right. And this conflict will also continue potentially after the person has died. So without that lack of communication, if there was certainly, well, if not there was any conflict, then there's certainly going to be potential for conflict after that because of the lack of communication that had happened pre-death. So often we'll see children, when their parent dies, not knowing or expecting what they end up seeing in the estate plan or the will, and that can cause some terrible conflicts between siblings after their parents' death and permanent long-term issues in their relationships. I think it doesn't have to be a formal sit down and formal communication either. Often these types of things, it's like you said, we don't talk about them generally over the dining table, but sometimes you can, and often sitting down with a cup of tea or a glass of whatever takes your fancy often is a good point for these things just to start to come out casually, and from there it can move on. It doesn't mean that you all have to sit down and have a very serious formal conversation.
Having done some presentations at the young beef producers out at Roma over the last few years, it's been interesting because they're the under 30-year-old kids, so to speak, kids that are at those functions. And when I present at those functions, it's amazing how many people come up and they just don't know how to start the conversation, which is actually number 4. But they don't know how to get mum and dad talking about it, and therefore everyone just lives in this sort of limbo, which really leads into the third issue, which is nobody's talked about a documented plan. There's no discussion around such, and nobody's going to start the conversation. So especially like, for example, this person in the other side of Broken Hill I was talking about. This kid who's one of 3 children, he's come home and he wants to stay on the land, and he's worked there now for a good number of years and starting his own family. And it's like there's no roadmap, there's no direction, there's no conversation around whether he's got a chance to take over. And sure, he's going to have to square up with his siblings and all those sorts of things. But you know, he doesn't know that, does he? So why would he spend all his time putting improvements and all that sort of stuff if he has no idea that he doesn't know what the plan is? And so conversation around that is ever so important as well.
I think also, like the document we discussed last time we spoke, with just answering some simple questions about what your wishes are and writing them and putting that down to paper is the best place to start, because the advisors are the ones that can help you with the formal documents, but by a documented plan, it can be as simple as in your own words what your wishes are on a piece of note paper, and you know, from there it will develop. But it's a start.
Yeah, and look, Juanita, you're absolutely right. And I always say start with the heart. You know, start conversations out of the heart, not out of your head, not out of what your accountant and other financial advisors are telling you, because you can get lost sometimes in the complexity. And I think that's it's one of the three things that really stops people taking action too, and why we end up with these four big issues is people don't know how much it's going to cost. They think it's going to be overly complex, and they think it's going to take a whole lot of their time. So there's time, cost, and complexity, and because they don't know the answer to that, you know, they don't start the conversation once again. And you're right. If someone can just sit down and say, hey, look, you know, forget the money, forget what you own, forget what you owe. Let's just tell me in your heart, you know, as the kids were growing up, what was your wishes for your children? What's the wishes for your business, and so on. And sometimes that's the greatest place to start, is just having a conversation about, you know, what your dreams and aspirations are, not getting tied up with, you know, how much you owe, how much you own, and how you're going to make it.
And I should add the warning: don't try to write your own will. This is just writing down your thoughts and your wishes from your heart, but you shouldn't be trying to write your will down on a piece of notepaper or a post-it, because that's when the lawyers can get involved if something happens and we've got little bits of paper everywhere. So it's just don't try to write the will yourself. Get your advisors to help you, but just start putting on paper what your wishes are, and as you said, Mark, your thoughts from your heart.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And dare I use the quote, the power of great questions, but I mean, the truth is, the skill that we have, Juanita, is knowing the questions to ask. And one of the most common questions is that people don't know what they don't know, or as Donald Rumsfeld would say, the unknown unknowns. And sometimes it's very hard for people to say, well, you know, okay, because people like to try and fix problems themselves. And I think this is why this is such a big issue, why it never, you know, so many people are without an up-to-date, adequate or appropriate estate plan or succession plan, is because people start thinking about it and their head hurts. It's kind of like they don't know what questions to ask themselves. They don't know what they need to be thinking about. They don't know what their options are. And the truth is they can't do it themselves. And so you really need a facilitator to come in and ask great questions, which will help you uncover what it is that you don't know. And that's where your greatest freedom's going to come from.
Yes, absolutely. And there's more to an estate plan than a will. And, you know, as we both know, Mark, so that starting point is the best place. As I've said before, I often ask my clients to come in and just tell me in their own terms what it is they want, because it's our job to help them get to the end, you know, get to the end game and have their appropriate estate planning in place.
Yeah, that's a great way to approach, and you do it that way, and that's probably why we work together like this, is because so many and I can say this, you probably can't because it's your profession, but I mean, a lot of lawyers are just order takers, and they sort of say, well, okay, now sit down, and they're GPs. They're not specialist estate planning lawyers, and so it becomes like taking an order. It's kind of, you know, like, do you want beetroot with that, or do you want an egg, or tomato, or pineapple, or whatever? And they just ask questions and say, okay, and they start with the what I call hard facts, which is, you know, how much do you own? How much do you owe? Give me a list of if you've got trusts and companies. And so start with all the complicated stuff, and then they just they then act like accountants and say, well, okay, we'll give this to this person, blah, blah, blah. And they focus on equality and and they try. It's like they're trying to get them out there as quickly as they can, and they haven't asked any good questions to find out what's inside, what's really in the client's head, and what's really in the client's heart. And so I commend you on the way that you start your conversations with clients, because I think estate planning is an emotional thing. I mean, it's not a clinical thing. It's when people die, they're not sitting around talking about money and structures and companies and trusts and all that sort of stuff. They cry. They get emotionally paralysed, and they want someone to hold their hand and make sure that they're going to be okay. And it's more about emotionally than it is anything else. And I told the story before, but I'll never forget the funeral I went to one of my clients last year, and the mother died, and the father, the son, and the daughter, they waxed on for weeks, because I knew what flowers Mum wanted on her coffin, and I knew what songs she wanted played coming in and going out. I knew which church, I knew where she wanted to be buried. I knew all those things, and that was worth more to them than testamentary trusts and asset protection and tax saving and all that sort of stuff at the time. At the time, it's emotional stuff, which is more important. So it's all very well to get all the facts, figures, and numbers right, but I mean, people want to know you care, and they want someone to be caring for them when one of their family goes.
That's right. Yeah.
Which kind of leads on, I guess, to number 4, which is the fourth number 4 of the big issues, and that's the truth is people don't know where to start. Not only do they not know the questions and they don't communicate and all that sort of stuff, but you sit down with an average person and say, well, have you thought about getting your estate and succession planning done? And one of the reasons is, well, they know they can't do it themselves, but they really don't know who to go to. They think if I go to a solicitor's, whatever the barriers are there, they don't know how to start the conversation, whether it's with the lawyer or someone like me or the rest of their family. There's just how do I open this conversation up? I don't want to sit down at dinner and talk about this with my wife and my kids, because everyone will start crying, getting emotional and so on. So they just kind of keep putting off the conversation, and they really need us to come along and say, hey, sit down, have a 30-minute free conversation with us, do whatever you like, but just sit down and start talking, and let us give you some direction in regard to the things you maybe haven't thought about, and a structured way to approach this, whether it's with us or with anyone. Sit down and let us give you some guidance in regard to how to best take action here.
Yeah, and I think the key here is just make a start, because we all know there's things in our lives, whether it be work or personal stuff or just stuff around the home, chores around the home, that you just don't want to get. You don't feel like doing it. It falls down the priority list. But when you just make a start, no matter how little it is, God, you feel so much better. So I think, just make that start, however little bit it is. If it's putting something down on paper, if it's having a small conversation, and then you'll feel better, and then things will go from there. So that start is so important and so helpful.
Look, absolutely, Juanita. I'm sorry for all the slides running there. I lost my little mouse pointer to bring us back to this screen. So I apologise for all those things flashing in front of you there while you were trying to talk. But from a general point of view, I thought today was just a good opportunity, before we start talking about some of the answers that to questions that people might have. I thought it was worthwhile talking about what tends to trip people up in regard to this whole topic, in regard to this whole conversation, and to help people who might be listening to understand it's normal to be feeling the way that they are.
Absolutely.
Because what we've just described, there's a 99% chance that whoever's watching this is saying, yeah, well, that kind of, one of those 4 things especially, or 2 or 3 of those, or all of those things are me. That's how they're feeling. And so I wanted to normalise what goes through most people's minds. And maybe, for the next session, that will prompt a few questions from people in regard to, what do they want to ask us? What are some of the issues which are most topical for them, and come from a place of feeling normal about, how they're feeling about this.
I would think it'd be very rare for someone to be entirely comfortable, speaking 100% about all these issues. And well, we are, of course, Mark, because we're trained in it, and that's our chosen profession. But for most people we see, it would be very unusual for someone to be entirely comfortable and confident unless they've been through this process, a few times. But as you said, it's totally expected and usual to have those feelings.
I'm going to put this on the spot here and ask you a question. I hope you're ready for this, and it comes without any notice whatsoever. So what I'd like to ask, because probably because I've done this the other day, my daughter interviewed me and asked me this tough question. She said, "Dad, why do you do what you do?" And in your background, you've obviously seen cases where people haven't paid attention to this. You've seen the bad side of what can happen. So what, if I can ask you, what kind of drives you to make sure that, you try and get people to do what's best for them when you take them through this process?
Well, obviously getting a good result at the end for the particular people and their families as a whole. You can really make a difference by what we can do to assist the client. And I think, through my experience with estate planning, I've also seen estate disputes. So I do a lot of work in estate disputes. So I can really, my learnings from seeing those, less than pleasant situations that I spoke about before, really assist me in coming back to the estate planning, because I can see what we can do to avoid those situations down the track, and it really can make an absolutely huge difference financially and also emotionally between people with relationships and families. Every family is different. Every single person that comes through the door has got a different story, a different family. No one's the same. So it's an interesting area for us as advisors, because it's not the same every day. Everyone's got their own story, and that's what we're able to learn and assist with.
Because I knew you'd done a lot of work in disputed estates, and you've actually seen, which is fantastic. From my point of view, I love the fact that you've seen the other end, where people haven't done a good job up front. They've gone for the cheap option or whatever. They haven't put time and effort into creating a good plan for their family. And look, I'm sure 99% of people love their family, and if they realise by not doing something what a bloody big mess they'd left at the other end, they'd turn in their graves. But the truth is, when people don't pay attention to this and don't do it properly, you've seen disputes, you've seen estates where money has just gone to the lawyers and so on because someone wants to contest a will because they feel slighted and they don't understand why mum or dad, structured a will in such a way because they thought that was fair, and so they felt slighted. They've contested the will, and nobody ends up with anything. And the worst part is families that never talk to each other again, where the kids, you've raised children and you've given them a great education and you've given them a start in life, and over something silly like money or not paying attention to the stuff that we do, kids just never talk to each other again. And as a parent, that's kind of like the worst scenario, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, I think this area of law is definitely, unfortunately, disputes a real growing area. And we're seeing up at the Supreme Court every day these disputes coming up. And so, they need to be resolved, but they should be able to be prevented, hopefully, before they ever get to that stage with some good estate planning.
That's my motivating thing is if you can have the communication, if you can create the family, you understand with my process, we, as the non-lawyer in this arrangement, I do all the human stuff, all the, try and get the relationships right, the conversations going, and have simple English conversations with people. And if what I like to do is to take each of the family members off individually. So I have conversation with mum and dad, then I talk to each of the kids individually to find out what their thoughts, expectation, their gratitude, their entitlement, whichever angle they're coming from. And then from that, and I guess this is my skill, is being able to say, well, okay, I've spoken to everyone individually and privately so that, it's not shared. I know how to now put this together so that effectively And there may be compromises here and there, but effectively everyone's going to be happy with the outcome, or everyone's going to be understanding of the outcome. And I keep coming back to conversation, but I mean, at the end of the day, it is the conversations that you have so that people understand why you're doing something. And if you don't have the conversations before you die, you're just setting yourself up for an absolute bloody fight at a blue after the funeral, when they're all sitting there in the solicitor's office going, okay, read me the will, and they go, bugger this shit I want. Why didn't I get this? Why didn't I get that? So if everyone understands before you go, then you're really eliminating 99% of the chance of contested will and squabbles.
Yeah, I agree. The key word is understanding. So people, they may not be entirely happy, but they understand why.
Yeah, sure. And but also the other thing is too, we bring to the table, Juanita, the conversations that you can't have, a family can't have themselves. So mum and dad can't sit down with the kids and have the conversations with people. You need an outsider to come in and have those classified conversations with the children, so that a lot of times I'm the bad guy. It's like mum and dad say, this is why we're doing it this way. And I go, okay, well, I'll be the bad guy. I'll go and explain to the kids why you're setting it up in this particular way. But at least the kids understand, and if anything, they're going to blame me because I've set it up for tax reasons, or whatever I've come up with, or whatever the real reason is for the way they've done things. But yeah, it's that understanding, and that's the key to it. Communication. And let me just say, communication is just the key to getting this sorted.
Absolutely, we'll let you be the bad cop, Mark.
Yeah, I'm good at it, evidently. But I mean, look, when I first see clients, I mean, as the facilitator, so I'm not the lawyer, I'm the facilitator that brings all this stuff together, and then comes to you to get the documentation done in the good process that you guys have. But when I sit down and talk to mum and dad, the first thing I always say is, okay, and this isn't being sexist, it's just, I'm here, mum, so if anything happens to dad, this is assuming dad's running the farm or he's the breadwinner or whatever, I say, I'm here to make sure, first of all, mum's okay. So if anything happens to dad, and mum doesn't know how to run the car dealership, the business or whatever, the farm, the cattle station, whatever, that she's going to be okay. So that's my first priority. And I say my second priority is that the kids will still get together at Christmas as mates and still have a nice time every year, even after you're gone. And they won't be sitting around squabbling over money, and they won't be not talking to each other because somebody got the wedding ring and somebody didn't get the wedding ring. All that conversation will have been had before that time.
You're right. And often the mum with the amazing business, dad won't know how to run that either.
That's right. So glad you balanced that up. Because there are a lot of mums. And that's the interesting thing about the Young Beef Producers Forum is it's the young ladies that come up afterwards, and they seem more interested in all this sort of stuff. They're more concerned about getting this right, because they don't want the arguments with their brothers and so on. They don't want the arguments with dad. They don't want the arguments with their brother and mum and everything else. So, yes, these days women are just as powerful as the men are. Am I okay now?
You're okay. You're okay.
Okay. Juanita, look, it's been great. Thanks for joining again today. Anything you want to finish off with before we wind up?
No, great. Thanks for having me. I think it's all this sort of conversation's quite intangible stuff, but really important, and leads on to the more nuts and bolts of the estate planning.
Yeah. So look, for anyone who's watching this, if you've got any questions, we've sort of got an agenda for things that we'll talk about if we don't get questions over the next few fortnights, and we intend to keep this going in the long term. But if you have got any questions, please send them in to either one of us. You'll find if you rewind the video, you'll find our details at the start of this. And please just send us an email, give us a phone call, either Juanita or myself, Mark Westcott, and we'll make sure that they're answered in the next session. So thanks for your time today, Juanita.
Thank you. Great.
And thanks for everyone watching. See you next
time.